In life, we all encounter obstacles, and those obstacles come in all different shapes, sizes, and forms. The question is, how do we handle those obstacles? Do we attack them head on, or do we allow them to make us quit? Welcome to the No Quit Living podcast, where we aim to motivate and inspire listeners to never give up on themselves, their dreams, or their goals. We will interview successful people from all walks of life as they share their no-quit stories when they had the choice to give up or give in, but they didn't. We thank you for listening, and we hope to be that jolt of positivity as you go for your greatness. Welcome to episode number 125 of the No Quit Living podcast. I'm your host, Christopher J. Worth, and today's theme of the day is persistence. Our quote of the day comes to us from Thomas Monson. If you are persistent, you will succeed. I am very excited to bring you today's episode. When it comes to a man with many talents, there isn't much Wes Yee hasn't done, tried, or will do within the music space. As the host of the No Quit Living podcast, I receive a lot of the credit for the show. However, our show wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for everything that Wes does behind the scenes. He definitely doesn't receive enough of the credit, but I wanted to say thank you, Wes, for all that you do. Without further delay, I hope you enjoy today's episode. Wes, I'd like to welcome you to the No Quit Living podcast.
Chris, thanks for having me, man.
I appreciate it, sir. So the first question we ask everybody is, are you ready to bring it today?
I've been ready, man. Hell yeah.
Definitely knew the answer. So the number one objective of our show is to motivate and inspire our listeners to never give up. Now, I was curious if you had either a personal story about perseverance or a challenging time that really tested you, but you kept on going and didn't give up.
Yeah, I've had a lot of those, man. To be honest, I don't think I've ever had an entrepreneurial venture that at some point I didn't feel like I wanted to quit. Because, being an entrepreneur is really difficult, and you're balancing life with work, with relationships, and it can definitely lead to somebody wanting to give something up. And sometimes that's the business, sometimes that's something else, but regardless, some sort of sacrifice is going to have to be made. So what our listeners may or may not know is that Chris and I actually know each other pretty well. I actually do the audio editing and I did the music for this show. But the story that I want to tell is actually before we even met. So it goes back about 3 years ago, I want to say. And it was right when I finished college. I don't even think I've ever told you this before, Chris, but I actually got evicted, fired, and sued all in the same week. So I'm going to tell that story, I guess, as short as I possibly can. I was basically put into an entrapment situation, housing-wise. So it was fresh out of college. I was 21 years old. I was very hungry. I was starting my first business as a jingle writer and producer, so I had a partner with that. But obviously, in the beginning, we weren't making any money. So I had to get a job working retail at the same time. So I'd do these 12-hour days almost every single day. Like I'd work 6 hours in the retail store, and then I'd do a back-to-back 6 hours with my partner. So I was doing that, and we had to get just a place that was as cheap as possible. So we put 5 of us into a 4-bedroom apartment, and we got it okayed by the landlord, who, I won't say his name or anything or his company, but if you Google him, he's got like 1-star reviews on Yelp. Everybody just kind of talks about how he scammed them or something, or they took him to court and won this amount of money off of him doing something to them. So basically we had 5 people in this 4-bedroom apartment. And in September, he told us it was totally cool. He said it would just go under the table. He told us we could have a cat because my roommate had a cat. And actually, the people who lived there before us also had 5 people in that apartment and a cat. So we had no reason to not believe that that was cool. But flash forward a couple months, he sends us a notice to quit saying that we have to leave within 28 days. Because he quote unquote found out that we had 5 people living in there, even though he was the one who initially okayed it. So he kind of knew what he was doing in the very beginning, and us being all pretty young and kind of naive, and it was my first time like being completely financially independent and kind of on my own. That was the last thing I'd ever expected. He seemed like a really nice guy. So that happened for one. We ended up fighting that and winning, but it still costed me lawyer fees, which was around $1,000, which was a lot for me at the time. And we had another roommate who was kind of like the friend of a friend situation. So she lived there as well. And she'd never lived on her own before, so she didn't really know how to shop for groceries or anything. So like if you know peanut butter and fluff, you ever heard of that? Like those sandwiches?
Oh yeah, one of the best combinations other than peanut butter and jelly.
So this girl would buy full jars of fluff and put the whole jar of fluff into a bowl and then eat the whole thing in one sitting. And one day she comes up to us and she says, "Hey, like I can't live here anymore. This is insane. Like you guys have too much junk food laying around and it's too tempting." And in my head I'm like, "Well, you're the one who puts all the fluff in the bowl," but I was like, "Whatever. If you want to move out, then move out." So she moves out, and then her dad was paying her rent, so he was sick of paying the rent and having her not live there. So she reaches out to us and says she wants to get a subletter, and she signed a 12-month lease. So we were like, okay, that's fine, but you have to get them approved by us. So we just want to meet them if we have to live with them for the next X number of months. And she was like, okay, yeah, that's fine. So she gets someone off of Craigslist who was definitely like kind of sketchy. He was this 40-something-year-old man, and he told us that he got kicked out by the couple that he was living with. But I didn't want to deal with it anymore, so I said it was cool. Everybody else vetoed this guy. She got another girl. Everybody was fine with the girl. Nobody wanted to deal with meeting more subletters anymore, except one guy just kind of vetoed it because he preferred having 4 people in the 4-bedroom apartment as opposed to 5, which isn't really a cool thing to do, but it's also not really my responsibility either at the same time to convince him to say yes to her. So he said no to her moving in, and she reached out to me because the way we paid rent is everybody would write me a check and then I'd write one big check. So she basically threatened to not pay rent if I couldn't convince the roommate to let her have the subletter, and I couldn't do that. So she took us all to court, and she had a really rich father who hired a lawyer, and none of us had ever been to court before. So it was kind of us, a bunch of 20-something-year-olds, against somebody who literally goes to court for a living. So we ended up having to mediate that, long story short. And just to add insult to injury, the one guy who who declined the last subletter, we're sitting in the courtroom. I remember we're in our suits and everything. And the day of, I remember I was feeling like kind of okay because, you know, power in numbers, there was more of us. And I remember he turns to me and he says, "Wes, I don't think I'm going to be able to maintain my composure in this courtroom. You have to do all the talking." And I was like, wow, like, thanks for, you know, staying accountable. This is kind of your fault that we're in this situation in the first place. So that happened. And, you know, honestly, getting fired was just me being irresponsible. It was totally my fault. But it kind of worked out for the best because I kind of was able to learn about myself that I'm not really the employee type of person. I'm more of an entrepreneur. But at around the same time, my jingle partner and I, we lost our first national deal. We were doing really well up until that point. And I think he got a little discouraged. But, you know, during this whole process, man, it was a week of just nonstop, just crap getting thrown at me. And I wanted to quit. So much of me wanted to just say, you know, maybe I'm not cut out for this yet. Maybe I'm not ready to do this. Maybe I should just move back home with my parents and you know, get my life a little bit more together. But I didn't. And I got another job where I met you. And we started this no quit living thing. And I actually didn't even tell my parents that I got fired, or they know I got evicted and sued. But I'm just the type of person who, when I guess something bad happens, rather than recoiling and kind of taking the easy way out, I'm the type of person who would rather try to figure it out until, you know, knock on wood, hopefully this never happens, but until basically I can't make it work. So you know, I made it work. I'm still alive. I have a new apartment where I don't have a slumlord, and I have roommates who are awesome, who aren't going to sue me, I hope. And I have some amazing businesses that I'm proud to be a part of.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that backstory. I knew bits and pieces of it, but not all of the story, how it happened in 3 things in 1 week. But it's not about, as we talk about all the time, whether you get knocked down or whether you encounter obstacles. The question is, what do you do and how do you learn from them? So you definitely get some credit for sticking to it, and I appreciate you telling your story. And I wanted to ask you if you wouldn't mind just telling the listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do specifically, in addition to all that you do with the No Quit Living podcast.
Yeah, totally. And actually, one of the reasons that I love the No Quit Living podcast so much is because we kind of have that same mentality and same mantra. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why you and I get along so well. And I love listening to every single episode. So my name's Wes, and I'm a graduate of Berklee College of Music, where I studied music production, audio engineering, and I dual majored in performance, actually. So I guess I wear a lot of hats. You know, I've done a lot of things. I was doing the jingles for a little bit. I've produced music that got licensed to MTV, VH1, Oxygen, E! I have a music production course on the internet. So I'm kind of adept with email funnels and marketing and that kind of thing. And then in addition to that, I do podcast stuff too. So I have my own podcast that I just started, and I've been working on No Quit Living since the very beginning, doing all the audio editing, and I did all the music as well. And then in addition to that, I'm in a mastermind group with other amazing podcasters, and I've worked with them and people that they've referred me to. So I'm in the podcast world as well, and really just trying to learn as much as I possibly can and just be prepared for any situation I get thrown into.
I think there's no better ways to connect with people, and that's one thing that I definitely know that you do on your end. And it was kind of one of the things that connected us. Is I was actually speaking up in Boston area, Boston, Massachusetts, on a financial speaking venture I was doing, and you and I connected, and a lot of like-minded opportunities. And I know we've connected directly and indirectly with a lot of other people, so I commend you for doing that. And it's interesting how you connect with people in life, and it's we often talk on the show, it's not 6 degrees of separation, it's 1 degree of separation, which is really neat. So I wanted to ask you, how do you personally, Wes, define success?
Definitely. And just really quick on that point, I mean, I've burned a lot of bridges too, so it's a process, and it's something that I continue to, get better at every single day, just by connecting with more people and figuring out how I can deliver value as much as possible. But back to the success thing, one of the cool things about this show too is I feel like, having heard other people who are older than me and definitely wiser than me and more successful than me talk about this question, is that it's kind of put what I've always believed into words, if that makes sense. So I used to define success as, I never defined it as monetary, otherwise I wouldn't have gotten into an industry like music, you know what I mean? But I would say words that were really general and vague, like happiness. Like if I'm happy, I'm successful, and whatever that means is whatever it means. But a word that gets tossed around a lot in this show that I really kind of back is the word freedom. So the freedom to do whatever you want, whenever you want, is definitely a big component of success, I think. But at the same time, the more I think about it and the more successful I get, and the more I realize how little free time I guess I have, even though I'm doing things that I really enjoy doing and that I love with the bottom of my heart, as an entrepreneur, you kind of have total freedom, but at the same time, not really at all, because you have other people who are relying on you, and you're getting emails all the time, and it's so content driven that you have to continuously put out great content for the people who follow you or support your product, or you have to continue moving with the market. So I think a big part of success is even just beyond being able to do whatever you want, whenever you want. I think it's also being okay with all the negative aspects as well. I'm a really big believer in balance. So I think whatever you give, you also end up getting back. And then the same thing goes vice versa. So whatever you end up getting, you're also going to have to sacrifice and give back relatively equal amounts. So I think being okay with the sacrifices that you have to make is another really, really essential component of being successful.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the freedom word is something that gets tossed around our show quite often, and it means obviously different things to different people. But as you mentioned something, I want to just echo that, is as we've gotten further along in our show, and forget my other ventures and entrepreneur things I do myself, but just with this show, we both get inundated with emails and requests and things, and it's amazing for what's happening. And I myself have been a guest on numerous shows, and I know you have as well. And you are correct, though. It is the interesting and the challenging and the moving target of keeping that balance and the focus. And it reminds me of a term that we've definitely spoken about in this show, and people talk about it throughout different businesses, it's the work-life balance. So I think it's definitely interesting. So wanted to ask you, if you had to define yourself in one word, Wes, what would that word be?
Interesting. Persistent, for sure. It's been used a lot, but I think it's just what really defines me. And I guess it kind of makes sense too, because I guess other people who are saying the exact same word feel the same way. You know, it gets used often, but I definitely wouldn't say that everybody I know is persistent, and it's definitely something that it's a characteristic rather that I think a lot of people on this show happen to have, and I think it's an important one too. So that's the word I would use to define myself.
No, it's
how about you, actually, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, that's flip the switch on me. I would say it's been changing over the last few months, but I would say it's positive and positivity. And the reason being is I've been hit with a lot of challenges these last 3 months, and the only thing that I can control myself each and every day is my attitude. And I think it's something that I personally take pride in. And I've said this many times on podcasts as well as a few times on stage, is life is so tough and it's impossible, and I'd be lying if I said I'm positive all the time, but I definitely try to be a lot more positive than negative. And something that we've talked on the show and you and I have talked offline is just trying to eliminate some of those negative things in your life. And unfortunately, it's a lot of negative people at times, but when you get to control yourself and who you spend time with, it's awesome. And you and I know a lot of really good people in common, and I think that's been one of the cool parts about this whole show.
I agree with you, man. And that's something I really like about you too and kind of admire. One thing that just kind of popped into my head that I just remembered. So I guess to our listeners, Chris and I were both featured on the EO Fire podcast by John Lee Dumas. And I remember you were on it first. And when you were on it, I remember you were sharing it all over the place and I was sharing it all over the place. And you were just so positive about the experience, and you were like, this is awesome. I was on this big show hosted by this person that I really admire. And I remember when I was on it, it was like the total opposite. I remember coming out of the interview feeling pretty good, but I don't think I slept the night before it actually came out, because he told us when what number episode we'd be and when it came out. And I didn't sleep the night before, and I remember the day it came out, I just got so many negative feelings of just anxiety and wondering if my performance was good, wondering if I was wasting people's time, because he has so many lists. He has 2 million downloads a month, and I was like, if this many people are going to be listening to it, I better have provided some value, and I didn't know if I did. And it was the first podcast I'd ever been featured on, so it was pretty nerve-wracking for me. So that's definitely something I admire about you. Even though I consider myself a pretty positive person, I definitely feel like I've got some work to do as well.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And, it's interesting is connecting with all these different people and asking that question of the word. You're the first person, the only person that flipped the script on me and asked me that aspect of it, which is interesting. So I wanted to ask you, as you know, we're always looking to add value to our listeners in different areas of their lives. If you have either a morning or a daily ritual that has helped you get to the level of success that you've achieved at this point in your life already.
Yeah, I totally do, and I've stolen it from other guests from this show. So the big theme recently has been not checking your phone in the morning. And it's weird too, because ever since guests have been saying that, call it Illuminati or the government at work or whatever, but I've been seeing all sorts of videos on YouTube and just other platforms of people talking about how important it is to not check your phone in that first hour of your day. So I watched a video the other day of a guy, I forget his name, but he said that he tries to control the first and the final hour of his day. He said those are the two most important, because the first one sets you up for the rest of the day. So the quote that I've been kind of reciting back and forth in my head is, if you win your morning, you win the day. And it's astounding how much of a difference it makes to win that morning. So immediately when I wake up, I turn my alarm clock off, but then I reset my alarm clock for 15 minutes. So I'll stay in my bed and I'll meditate for those 15 minutes. Once that alarm goes off, which is like the worst thing in the world, because I hate my alarm sound, especially if I'm deep in meditation, but it's so essential, otherwise I'd just be there all day. That's when I get up and I don't check my phone. I actually started putting it on the other side of my room, and I just keep it on mute so there's no temptation or anything, and I have it face down. After that, this is gonna sound weird, but I have this this quote unquote potion, if you will. It's Himalayan salt water. So it apparently it's like this alkaline thing. I don't know a ton about it, but I've just heard that it helps your immune system, and drinking a glass of water right when you wake up is really good for your nervous system as well. So I've been doing that for a while, but I recently started putting the pink salt into the water. So I drank that, and it tastes awful, but it definitely gives me some more energy. And then I scribbled down my to-do list before I get my coffee, and then the rest of the day is forward and onward. And then I'll probably check my phone.
No, I appreciate you telling our listeners a little bit about that. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I saw a similar video. I'm not sure if it's the same one, but Tom Bilyeu, who has an amazing show and video out there. He's Impact Theory. He's done some amazing things. And I believe that's where I saw the same gentleman talking about the first hour of the day and the last hour of the day. And I was actually
same video.
Yep, and I was speaking to actually a friend of mine at the gym I go to, and he's a few years older than me and very successful in business. And he said something interesting. There was a bunch of us talking, and he was actually talking about our podcast show. And he said something that he said, in his busy day, he's got 3 kids and he's married, and he said he's on a couple boards. And he said, the only thing I can control, he said, is how I wake up in the morning. He said, and then how I go to bed at night. And he said, literally, my phone goes off. One of my kids maybe forgets something, or has a game, or has a play, or has something at school. I have a meeting. He says, and it gets going. And then all of a sudden, like you mentioned, once you turn on your phone and things just happen. So he said, what I can do is, he said, I can control my day, because if I don't turn on my phone, or if I don't look at it, and instead of waking up at 7, if I get up at 6, he said, I have that hour to do what I want to do. And he said, at night, he said, there's no television show or anything that has to be done. He said, you have a choice. Do you want to watch this or do you not? And he said what he does is he puts his phone, or turns his phone off on airplane mode, and he reads for a while and just hangs out. He does a little bit different meditation stuff, takes a shower, and goes to bed. But it's interesting because it's the common theme literally over the last 2 months has been the importance of winning your morning and winning your day. And then a couple guests have actually talked about winning your morning, but then when you win your day, or excuse me, when you win your evening, it helps you set up the next day for success as well. And I think that's interesting, and I appreciate you sharing some of that stuff with us.
First of all, I think that's really smart. And I also think that just as society as a whole, I think we're starting to really see the negative aspects of our phones and this virtual world that we have, as amazing as it is. We're starting to realize that it can also have, negative impacts. This is kind of the whole balance thing again. And that's why I think now especially is where people are starting to talk about it more, and starting to realize when is the best time to use it and be kind of immersed in it, and when is not. So I think that's the reason why we're seeing so much of it now.
No, so it's interesting you touch on that, Wes, because I think that has been such a fascination of mine over the last few months. Is in today's day and age, technology is amazing. And I was just talking to a friend a couple weeks ago. If this was 15, 20 years ago and somebody was 60 years old and they got cancer, a lot of times, unfortunately, they'd be dead, a couple months or a year later. Now, where technology and medicine and everything is being so quickly advanced, is somebody at the age of 80 gets cancer, and all of a sudden 2 years later, they're cancer-free and they live another 10 or 11, 12 years. The flip side of that with technology is it's amazing how many things change and continue to change. But like you said, it's the 24-hour syndrome, where it's like, okay, just because you have a phone or just because you have a tablet or a laptop, it doesn't mean you need to be accessible to everybody. And it also doesn't mean that you need to check things nonstop. Now, if you're a doctor on call or something, you'll have your pager on and a cell phone where, God forbid, someone has an emergency. But I was talking to a friend of mine a few weeks ago, and I remember just a concept, and he was like, why do people need to check their Twitter accounts and Instagram and Snapchat at 11, 12 o'clock at night, or first thing in the morning, first thing at night? He's like, if anything's really important, and he asked a question to me, and it's literally been repeated in my head so many times. He said, if there's an emergency or something that needs to be done, he said, are you ever going to post it on Instagram or Facebook? And I was about to answer, and he said, no. He said, if I need to get to you, so if I need to talk to you, Wes, I'm not going to send an Instagram message out and say, hey, Wes, what's going on, buddy? I'm going to pick up my phone, and I'm going to call you. And if you don't pick it up, I'll call you again or I'll text you. But it's interesting because, to your point, is technology is amazing, but I think we also need to take a step back and say, okay, where are we going with technology? Because I think it can be too much.
Yeah, I agree, 100%.
So I wanted to ask you if you've read anything recently, any books or anything you'd like to recommend or mention to our listeners.
Yeah, I'm reading a pretty interesting book right now, actually. It's called Predictably Irrational. I have it on PDF here, so I can actually get you the author. It's by Dan Ariely. It's a really interesting book, especially if you're an entrepreneur, especially if you're not really, I guess, quote unquote salesperson, although I hate that word, because it's all about the psychology of pricing. So just that main component of it. So for example, it talks about how we perceive price relative to other prices. So if you were standing in like a CVS or whatever trying to buy a pen, and it's a $20 pen, and somebody in line whispers in your ear and says, hey, they're doing a sale for that exact same pen, it's $13 5 minutes away, chances are you'll get in your car, you'll drive the 5 minutes to get that $13 pen, save the $7. But if you're buying, let's say, like a $1,000 suit or something, and somebody comes and whispers in your ear in line and says, hey, you could save $7, get that same exact suit 5 minutes away for $993. Chances are you're just going to buy the $1,000 suit right there. Because in relation to the 1,000, the 7 doesn't sound like very much, even though the value of the $7 is the exact same. So it's a really interesting book, just about how people perceive price and relate it to value. So if you're an entrepreneur with a product or some sort of service, and this is kind of unfamiliar territory to you, I definitely recommend that book.
Is that a new book? I've never heard of that one.
I don't know when it came out. I forget where I heard of it too. I think it's pretty old.
So changing lanes, one of the things obviously we touch on most of our shows is a quote, and I actually have a quote that I found, I believe it was a week ago. It's hardworking todays make high winning tomorrows. It's by William Holler. And I was curious, Wes, if you have a favorite quote yourself.
Yeah, I've got a lot actually, and I get a lot of them from this show. I want to give a unique one. It's by Miles Davis, and it goes, what you don't play is just as important as what you do play. If for some reason someone doesn't know who Miles Davis is, he's a really famous jazz trumpet player, and he was really known for kind of being the first musician to really use a lot of space. So he'd spend a lot of time in his music just literally not playing, just letting it be silent. And I think the beauty of that is it kind of allows listeners to kind of process what's happening, and I think it can be taken outside of the musical context as well. Especially with like conversation. I think conversations are supposed to be 50-50. They're supposed to be two-sided. And I think so many people who I know at least often make their conversations one-sided, which is fine, but it definitely doesn't allow you to have as deep of a, I guess, learning experience the same way Miles Davis was such a genius to realize that by playing less notes, he could actually have more of an impact with his music. So I think that's a really important quote.
No, that's an awesome quote, and I've definitely heard that quite a few times, and I think it comes to the point you said before is conversations, and I think we're all guilty. I'm definitely guilty myself, is you kind of think about what you're going to say and your retort as opposed to actually listening to the other person. And I think it's interesting that it is a music quote, and obviously Miles Davis is one of the most famous musicians of all time, and his music will live on forever and ever just because of how talented he was. But it's interesting how that quote can obviously touch on so many parts of life. So I was curious, speaking of touching on life, is if you have any piece of advice that you've received yourself that you'd like to share with our listeners.
Yeah, I've been really fortunate to have had a lot of really amazing mentors. Chris, I'd even consider you one. And just amazing people in my corner. And just different peers I can talk to about really anything. So I think a really important thing to realize, and you actually reminded me of it because you said just the word talent when you were describing Miles Davis, and you said he's the most talented musician. I I understand the word, but I've always been really against using that word, just because, in my opinion, I don't want to say quote unquote talent doesn't exist, but I think work overpowers talent and trumps it 100% of the time. And even these people who have quote unquote talent or natural abilities, which I'm not even convinced Miles Davis had, they really work and they really grind. And the beauty of that is that literally anybody can do it. It's the same as the positivity thing. Literally anybody can change their own mindset and kind of get the things that they want to get out of life. And that's a really beautiful thing once you realize that. And I think also what another piece of advice I would just give that I've heard and just kind of realized on my own is that you only get more comfortable doing something that's uncomfortable by doing it. So for example, I think the EO Fire thing is a perfect example, actually. It was my first podcast interview, and it's probably the biggest podcast I've been interviewed to date, until this show overpasses it. But
yes, sir.
But that was really uncomfortable to have been on that show. But since then, I've been doing more podcast interviews, and it's even gotten to the point where I started my own podcast. And now I can say that I'm a lot more confident than I was back then. I'm not perfect, but it's been a lot of improvement just mentally for me. And it's really cool because now I can jump on these shows and feel prepared and feel like I deserve to be on the shows. And that wouldn't have happened had I not kind of jumped in head first. So I think that's a piece of advice I would give.
No, that's good advice, and it's interesting. It reminds me of the quote by Tim Notke. I think I'm pronouncing his name the right way, but it's hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. And I think at the end of the day, it's obviously you have to have some talent or skill in an area or endeavor. You just can't wake up and have zero skill and say, I'm going to work my butt off and succeed. Now, to your point, that doesn't mean that everybody that succeeded has been amazingly talented. It comes down, I think, a lot of times to how hard you're willing to work. So I'm glad you touched on that. So I want to change lanes for a minute. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just really quick. I think anybody with 10 fingers can play the piano. That's just kind of my 2 cents on it.
Well, I would, as a piano player myself, I would say that's true, but I would also say that it doesn't mean you're a good piano player.
Okay, fair enough.
Or a great piano player, because you do have to put the work in. But I definitely agree with what you're saying, and I think it deals with sports and business and school as well. As you can take a skill or something that you maybe don't have, and you can become proficient in it. And the question is, if you want to work hard enough, you can become pretty darn good in it too.
Exactly. Yep.
So wanted to change lanes. You touched on it before, your podcast, The Music Journal, and I wanted to just see if you could share for literally 20, 30 seconds with the listeners of what it is, why you're doing it, but more importantly, when you're launching it and where they can find it.
Yeah, totally. So like Chris said, it's called The Music Journal. And the premise of it is basically to document trending musical topics as they happen. We're trying to make history here. But then I take it a step further, and I talk about the ways that aspiring music producers and aspiring artists and aspiring entrepreneurs can kind of take the things that are trending and apply them to their own careers. So it's something that I've heard called valuetainment. I think it's a really ingenious word that I probably heard on this show too, and I probably follow somebody who said it at some point on this show on social media. And that's why that word just kind of resonates with me so much. But valuetainment is really what I'm trying to bring to all of the listeners. And I just find myself kind of engulfed in so much valuetainment myself that it only feels right that I start giving it back.
I think that was episode 99 with Patrick Bet-David. He's got his valuetainment website, YouTube channel, and he's doing some pretty cool things. But I think that word is awesome because I know you now very well, and you're definitely all about bringing the value. So I would recommend to our listeners, especially those that are fans of music, to check it out. So I wanted to ask you, Wes, maybe a tough question, but if you could have dinner with anybody, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
I've actually, it's not that tough because I've thought about it before, because I've heard this show, obviously. So it didn't blindside me the way it does some guests. But, so I guess a little more background. I'm first generation in this country, which means I was born here, but my parents weren't. So they, they struggled a lot, and getting here was not the easiest thing by any means for them. So I know their stories pretty well, and I wouldn't say that I know my grandparents' stories very well. One of them passed away when I was very young, and she did a good portion of raising me. And then from my father's side, they immigrated here too, but they don't really speak any English, and they speak a dialect of Chinese that's not really used anymore. It's kind of a dated dialect, which is another whole crazy thing to think about. But if I were to sit down with somebody for dinner, dead or alive, it would definitely be somebody in my family tree higher than them, probably one generation above them, just so I could get their perspective on things and kind of just fill in the gaps of my history, I guess, in my ancestry, in my own head. And we'd have to break the language barrier somehow too, so I'd bring a translator.
I was about to say, now if you fast forward a year or so, there's probably be an app that fully translates conversations on the spot, so you might not even need to bring a translator.
I feel like I saw something like that on Facebook just like the other week.
Yeah, I'm sure there is, and I'm sure it's just going to be a matter of time before literally you can be having conversation with anybody as long as you have a phone or an app next to you.
Yeah, I'm excited for that.
So before we wrap up, Wes, I wanted to ask you, what's the best way for our listeners to connect with you, follow you, or find out a little bit more about some of the awesome things you are always working on, and what else is coming up? In addition, if there is something, as you mentioned, with your music course as well as your podcast, which is coming out.
Yeah, totally. So, Facebook is home base for me. So, facebook.com/WESYEEMUSIC. If you're interested in hearing my music, I'm on Spotify, WESYEE. I've only been putting out my own music for less than a year now, but kind of getting close to that year mark. And I was checking my stats today, and I have over 1,000 monthly listeners on Spotify, which feels pretty cool, and it's growing by the hundreds every single day for the past week or so. So you can find me there. I just put out a new EP a couple days ago. And then if you're interested, a story that I actually thought about telling as my no-quit story is a police officer actually smashed into my car a few months ago while I was stopped at a stop sign. And it was totally his fault, but he ended up getting fired. I ended up losing money. It was a whole thing. And I wrote a song about it. If you'd like to download it, it's absolutely free. You can get that at bit.ly/WESYEEFREESONG.
And we will have all these in the show notes as well. So, Wes, last question, my man, is do you have some parting words you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah, I think I kind of covered it with the advice, but if I could just reiterate it, I guess, being in your comfort zone is just going to leave you exactly where you are. And if you're totally cool with that, kudos to you. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes I actually find myself envying people who are totally content and happy with, doing their 9-to-5s, working in finance or something more, I guess, consistent and stable than music production. But at the end of the day, I'm really happy with the path that I took. And I think it's really important to just make the step and make the effort to get out of your comfort zone as often as possible. One of the best pieces of advice I heard that I'd probably tell myself every day, just from hearing the show, is that successful people say yes and figure it out later. So you say yes to something first, and then it's going to be uncomfortable because you are now pressured to do it. But I found when I did that, every time I do that, every time it's successful, it feels incredible. Every time I'm unsuccessful, I learn from it. So that would be my parting words, I think.
No, that's great advice. And I think as we all look back at different points in our lives, it's not the shots that you took that you wish you took more of. A lot of times it's the shots that you didn't take. So I think that's great advice. And it is important to get out of your comfort zone. And I think it doesn't mean, fail or success. It just means you try something different. It could be something little or it could be something huge. But I really appreciate you being a guest on our show today, and wanted to just give a special kudos and thanks to you, because if it wasn't for you doing a ton of the stuff behind the scenes, and as I've mentioned on many shows, as the host of this show, I get a lot of the credit and the kudos, which is not always fair because there's so much stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So just wanted to thank you for that, but more importantly, thank you for being on the show, my man.
Hey, thank you for everything, man.
Thank you for listening to episode number 125. Wes shared some very interesting perspectives, as well as a very tough time that definitely challenged him a few years ago. Although his definition of success was similar to others, Wes used two words that I felt made a lot of sense and really stood out: freedom and balance. In his own words, Wes also reiterated a common theme that has been consistent when it comes to morning routines. Wes was adamant about not checking his phone the first thing in the morning, as well as controlling your morning and eventually controlling your evening. We also had a very interesting conversation about the relationship between work and talent, especially when talent doesn't work hard. In his closing remarks, Wes spoke about how being in your comfort zone will only leave you where you are, and why it is so important to get out of your comfort zone. The last thing he said I thought was very interesting. Wes shared how successful people say yes first and figure it out later. So to wrap up today's show, where do you find yourself? Are you stuck in your comfort zone, stuck with status quo, or are you looking to take your life to a whole new level? Are you the type of person that says no first? Or are you the type of person that says yes to opportunities and figures the rest out later? As you go about your day today, I challenge you to both think and act outside of your comfort zone. And if and when an opportunity presents itself, say yes first. Say yes and figure it out later as you go for your greatness. And lastly, to our listeners, thank you. We truly appreciate your time, and we hope our episodes inspire you to keep on attacking life and never giving up. To quote Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, it's always too early to quit.